start? Okay, I hope you enjoyed your lunch break. This afternoon session is called Globalization, Free Trade and Sustainable Development, and it's particularly relevant for those of you who are interested in business, in economics, in finance. Metropolitan University offers a whole study program called International Business in English language, but you will also have to take economics courses if you decide to study international relations and European studies, for example. So I hope it's relevant for most of you. I understand you had a session on the topic War and Peace earlier this morning, which focused more on the political aspects, I guess. So luckily we don't have too many wars going on at the moment, at least not wars for territory. In my presentation, first of all, I will focus on, let's call it economic wars or conflicts that are going on, wars for resources. This is the world as we know it today, with about 7 billion people living on the planet at the moment. If we take a look into the future, 20 years from now, this is what the world will look like, not geographically, but it shows the relative importance of world regions in terms of population. And you see that world population will increase from 7 to 8 billion people over the next 20 years, and the majority of this population will be living in countries such as India, China. So there will be a massive shift in relative importance of economic power. So let's look at some of the aspects that this shift brings with it from an economic point of view. First of all, these newly emerging economies, China, most of all, they will need a lot of energy, and energy resources are distributed very unevenly across the world at the moment, especially when we talk about fossil fuels such as coal, gas, oil. So you see here the countries that have most of those resources, but other countries who will probably need those resources most in the future have no or very little access to energy resources. For example, it is expected that by the year 2030, about 2/3 of all oil and gas exports will come from the countries of the Persian Gulf, like Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Emirates, Saudi Arabia. So it will be very important for those countries who get their energy resources from that region to have safe access to those resources, meaning especially transport routes will increase in importance. Transport routes meaning shipping routes, meaning pipelines. So this will play a major role over the next decade or two. Especially when we look at the interest of the United States. I don't know if you heard about the Strait of Hormuz, which is expected to be the economic bottleneck in the next years, because about 1/3 of all oil exports will have to pass through this narrow strait, which is located here in the Persian Gulf. And if you look at the map, you see that this can cause potential problems, because it's only about 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and the neighboring country is Iran, which has already in the past threatened several times that they would cut the supply. So that's why especially the United States is very active in this region. The whole Fifth Fleet is based only to protect this oil transport routes. They have 20 warships, aircraft carriers, just to make sure that energy transport, energy supply will not be interrupted for the United States. So this is the main interest of the United States. If we look at China, supposedly the coming big economic giant, what is the main interest of China? It's very similar. China will also be dependent on oil from the Persian Gulf. At the moment, China has to import oil via the shipping route to the Strait of Malacca. So this is not an ideal situation for China because in case of war or anything, it's very unsafe. So what China is planning to do, or already has started to do, is they try to build a port here in Pakistan. This is what it looks like, big construction work going on at the moment. And the idea is that in addition to this port, there will be a pipeline through the Himalaya to connect the oil with the western part of China, which needs most of the energy at the moment, in order to avoid this long shipping route. That's the one big project for China. In addition, they're trying to build a second port at the west coast of Burma. The idea is the same, just to cut the transport route for oil from the Persian Gulf. This is a region that should also cause conflicts in the future. It's the border region between Russia and China. Very often we forget that China has a very long border with Russia, because when we think about Russia, we most often only think the part to the Ural Mountains, but further east there's a big part of Russia bordering to China. And there are many natural resources, especially gold, iron ore, coal, which at the moment are not really being exploited because conditions are very difficult in this region. But as China will need more resources, it's expected that this region could also cause conflicts in terms of border conflicts between Russia and China. This is an ongoing dispute between China and Japan also. I don't know if you heard about it. It's about a small group of islands, also about oil, really. Okay, let's move on from fossil fuels. There are other resources on the planet that are becoming increasingly scarce. If we look at mineral resources, such as metals, copper, iron, gold, we'll have the same situation. The distribution is very uneven. So you have countries who are very rich in mineral resources, other countries don't have access at all. China again plays a very particular role when it comes to mineral resources because China disposes of a lot of them. I don't know if you heard the term the rare earth elements. These are special types of metals, resources that are needed, for example, to produce flat screen TVs, to produce smartphones. And so what China did in recent years is they cut exports of these rare earth materials. And other countries are complaining, of course. The EU is complaining, the United States are complaining. The strategy is that China does not want to be only an exporter of those raw materials. China wants foreign companies to come to China and also produce those high-tech devices in China. That's the idea behind cutting the export of those rare earth elements. Like I said, it is leading to disputes within the World Trade Organization. We will see later how the World Trade Organization deals with those type of disputes. So, oil, metals, the next important resource, probably the most important resource in the future, water. This map shows you that in the year 2030, there are predictions that about 50% of the world's population will live in areas where water is scarce. And if you remember our first map, it's exactly those regions with a very high population growth. India, Africa. Just one example that these disputes are already happening at the moment. You know the river Nile in Africa, most of us associated with Egypt, but the river really rises in Ethiopia. Ethiopia has announced plans that they want to dig a big dam just on the border to the neighboring countries, Sudan and Egypt. Also big protests. Egypt and Sudan are worried that Ethiopia will cut their water supply. This is just one example of many that we could see in the future when it comes to scarce water resources. Especially also in the region India, Himalaya, where we have all the glaciers. These glaciers are melting, it's a fact, and this means that the rivers that are rising from those glaciers, they get less fresh water. So there will also be a shortage of fresh water in this part of the world. And again, this is where most of the world population will be living, so potential conflicts. Another aspect of shortage of water is shortage of fertile land to agriculture. Also probably not so well known, not an issue that is very much in the news, but there's a lot going on in the area of agricultural soil. Many countries are experiencing a lot of population growth, but they don't have a lot of land. Just think of countries such as Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, even China. China seems to be a big country, but China does not have that much fertile land. So what these countries are doing already now, they go abroad and purchase land in other countries. Just some examples you see here where Japan, for example, is purchasing land in Latin America, North America. One extreme example is the African country of Mozambique, very fertile country on the east coast of Africa. Since the year 2000, so over the last 10-15 years, more than 20% of all the land of Mozambique were sold to foreigners, foreign countries. You see here the countries, Brazil, South Africa, Sweden even. These countries are purchasing land abroad. Another consequence of climate change, most of you have heard about climate change, is it happening or not? It definitely is. If you look at this image, so this shows you the world from top. If you look at the North Pole in the year 2000 and what it looked like last year, you see that the ice is melting. There are ecological aspects to that, but also important economic consequences. Can you think, why is it economically, what are the economic aspects of this climate change if the ice in the Arctic is melting?
The water level will rise and some of the places will be flooded. Therefore, there will be no one to buy products.
Okay, so the rise of the water level is one aspect, yeah, that can affect certain countries. Also,
a lot of ills.
A lot of
Ills.
Diseases.
Sorry.
My point is that you have suddenly new transport routes, especially if you have to transport goods from, let's say, Europe to the Far East. There are new possibilities now. If the Arctic is free of ice, and it is most of the summer months now, ships can use two new routes. They can use the Northwest Passage or the Northeast Passage. Northeast Passage, for example, if you leave Europe here and ship your goods along the Russian coast through the Bering Strait to the Far East. It is economically very important because it cuts the transport route almost 4,000 kilometers. And many companies are starting to use these new transport routes. Second consequence, if the ice in the Arctic is melting, there's suddenly access to many new resources. So there are some estimates that about 25% of the world's undiscovered energy resources are to be found under the Arctic ice. So at the moment there's a race going on to claim those areas that are now newly free of ice. But it's not so clear. There are legal disputes going on. Who is the owner if suddenly ice is melting and you can have access to drill in new parts of the sea? These are the countries that are fighting this dispute, mainly the United States, Russia, Canada, Norway, Iceland, Denmark. The main idea here is that countries have so-called exclusive economic zones. Every country that has access to the sea, also has this so-called exclusive economic zone, meaning 200 miles from your coastal line you have the exclusive right to fish, for fishing, for drilling, any other economic activities. And all these neighboring countries in the Arctic are now trying to redefine their exclusive economic zones. You may have seen this image. Russia was very quick to reinforce its claims. Anybody seen this image before, what it means? So Russia was very quick to send a submarine and to place its flag on the seabed of the Arctic, which again causes conflicts, in this case with Canada. Canada says it's a violation of their waters. So this was the first part, just to give you some ideas of what's going on, what are the main possible conflicts when we talk about globalization. The second part of my presentation will focus on world trade. Also relevant to all of us. Just imagine what a world without trade would look like. You know, all the products we buy, the markets, many of them come from far away, many come from China and the Far East. So let's have a little look about world trade and the organization that regulates and supervises world trade, which is the World Trade Organization. Here you see the member states. Russia also joined recently, so Russia is also a member of the World Trade Organization now. It's based in Geneva, Switzerland, and it tries to make sure that trade can happen as free as possible. Not all world countries are members, but let's say those countries that are doing most of the world trade are members. That's why it's so important. About 90% of the world trade, or even more, are done between members of the WTO. Just some background, the ideology, why is free trade such a great thing? This dates back to the classical theories of free trade. And I don't know if you're familiar with the names Adam Smith, David Ricardo. For those of you who are more interested in the history of economics, I've brought some posters which give you an overview of the names and theories, so feel free to grab your free sample afterwards. So in theory, economics says that free trade is great, it's good for everybody, but in practice, almost every country in the world puts some barriers in place, some protections, and not all countries are allowing free trade. One good example was the Great Depression in 1929, when many countries closed their economies because they wanted their own industries to produce it. They thought importing goods is bad because you lose jobs in your country. Okay. In the beginning, the World Trade Organization was called GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It was only changed to World Trade Organization in 1994. do you know, is it successful? What's going on at the moment with the World Trade Organization? Is it progressing a lot, or? The thing is, at the moment, the negotiations are quite stuck because we have so-called trade rounds within the World Trade Organization. The deals are negotiated in trade rounds, meaning everybody has to agree on everything with everybody else, and until everything is agreed, nothing is agreed. So this is done in trade rounds, and we've had 9 rounds so far. The last round started in November 2001 and is still ongoing. There's no conclusion, no agreement reached. Why do you think they cannot agree on a common trade deal?
Because they are greedy.
Sorry? Well, first of all, it's the number of members. If you look at the beginning, the World Trade Organization had 20 members. It has grown to 160. So the sheer number makes it more complicated to find a compromise. But also the topics that the World Trade Organization is covering are becoming more and more complex. At the beginning, they were just trying to reduce tariffs between countries, tariffs on products. Today, the World Trade Organization also looks at things such as patent rights, intellectual property rights, things that are more difficult to agree on. One important step was when China joined in 2001, because China today, sometimes called the factory of the world, it's the biggest exporter of finished goods at the moment. So it was very important when China finally joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. All of this is visible, but do you know how those goods reach us when we purchase electric devices from China, for example? This is how they reach Europe via container ships normally. So they're leaving China, you have to go all the way through the Suez Channel, and usually they are shipped to the northern ports in Europe, Rotterdam. What's your estimate? How long does it take to get a container ship from China to Europe? 2 weeks? 1 month? It's 30, 35 days, depending where you ship it to in Europe. But you can estimate about 1 month. This is what those big freight terminals look like. Biggest container terminal in Shanghai, for example. This is the biggest container ship in the world at the moment. This ship is always going this route that we just seen between China and Europe, back and forth, back and forth. How long do you think is this ship? One guess. This one is about 400 meters long. This is kind of an exception because this ship travels the same route all the time, but most other ships that are on the oceans at the moment, they do not know where they will go next. It's all negotiated very short time because this shipping industry, they have to be very flexible because if there's some delay, somebody is losing money somewhere. So those ships have to be flexible. Usually those trade routes are negotiated in London. This is called the Baltic Exchange, which is the major forum for international shipping. Nothing to do with the Baltic countries, just a convention name. Interestingly, this graph shows you the prices for shipping, how much you have to pay to ship a container around the world. And you see these prices have reached the top in the year 2008. And then when we had this economic crisis in 2008, the prices for shipping containers dropped about 95% within a very short time, simply because there was so much overcapacity built that those shipping companies had to cut prices drastically. And at the moment the level is still very low, so at the moment it's very cheap to ship goods around the globe. The main principle of the World Trade Organization is the so-called Most Favored Nation Clause, MFN. It simply means if you as a country give some other country special favor, a low tariff on a product, you have to give the same favor to all other member countries of the World Trade Organization. That's the theory, but in practice there are some exceptions, because some regional trade areas are allowed to treat themselves better than the other members. At the moment there are 4 big regional free trade areas in the world. You know them. One of them is the common market of the European Union, of course, but we have 3 other big free trade areas in the world. NAFTA, North American Free Trade Area. The Latin American countries have joined in the Mercosur, and Asian countries have the ASEAN with 10 Asian member countries. The main dispute when it comes to negotiations in the World Trade Organization is always around agriculture, agricultural products, because these are industries that are usually very protected, both in the European Union and in the United States. Both countries protect their farmers, mostly for political reasons. People do not want to mess with the farmers. So basically the EU and the US accusing each other that they have unfair protection in place for their farmers. This is a headline from the year 2011 from David Cameron, where he says we should finish this trade round. It's called the Doha round. By the end of this year, we have 2014 now, there hasn't been any progress. So there are some initiatives that try to bypass this deadlock. One of them, you may have heard it, is a special deal between the European Union and the US, just a bilateral deal, the so-called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And if you follow the election for the EU Parliament, there are big discussions about this trade deal. Did you hear some criticism? Why is it criticized? Well, basically people are afraid that this deal will lower certain quality standards within the European Union, that it would allow things such as genetically modified food, things like that. Also in general, people complain that these negotiations are not very transparent, and there will be a shift of power to multinational companies that are trying to pursue their own interest within this new negotiation framework. So this is what's going on in the area of trade, free trade or not so free trade at the moment. Finally, let's have a quick look at the financial aspects. International monetary flows. We said for trade we have the World Trade Organization. For the financial sector we have the IMF as the main forum for financial cooperation on the planet. And you see here that almost all members of the world are members of the IMF. There are just a few small exceptions. Countries such as Cuba, North Korea, for obvious reasons, are not joining the IMF. The important thing to understand the IMF is the distribution of voting rights, the so-called quotas. Each country has a quota within the IMF, which is based on its contribution that you have to pay in. And you see the biggest quota is held by the United States with over 16%. Does not look too much, but it is very important because in order to get an important decision through in the IMF, you need an 85% majority, meaning the 16% quota held by the US represents veto, so the United States can veto every important decision, meaning they have a very dominant position in the International Monetary Fund. This is sometimes referred to as conditionality. They can determine the terms and conditions. If some country needs assistance from the IMF, they can decide what policies they need to implement in exchange. Now, some countries are complaining that this is not fair, it doesn't represent economic reality anymore, which is true. And therefore, in 2010, it was agreed that certain countries would get more voting rights, and especially those BRIC countries. If you heard this abbreviation before, it's just a term for those newly emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So these countries are becoming increasingly influential. They have their voting rights increased. This was announced by the then managing director of the IMF, the French, Dominique Strauss-Kahn. If you remember, he had to resign over some scandals. This is the current managing director. Again, French. Do you know why? Is there any reason why there always seems to be some French person with the IMF?
It's a deal somehow that the director is always French.
There is a deal. It's not particularly about France, but it's about Europe. So it's kind of a gentleman's agreement. The managing director of the IMF is always European. What's the second part of the deal?
The director of the World Bank is American.
Exactly. In exchange, the director of the World Bank is always American. It's not written anywhere, but it's kind of like I said, a gentleman's agreement. And this is the current managing director, former French finance minister. So the IMF says that it's the main institution for international economic policy, economic cooperation. But then again, you will find other institutions or other groups, such as the G20, for example, that also say we are the main forum for international economic cooperation. Who is more important, do you think? G20, IMF? At the moment, probably the G20, just different things. The IMF is really a formal institution with a headquarter and everything, while the G20 is really just an informal group, doesn't have any permanent secretariat or legal framework. But of course, most important decisions are today taken within the framework of the G20, especially because the IMF is often accused that it has lost its original purpose. It was founded after the Second World War to stabilize the system of fixed exchange rate, which is no longer in place. If you know, today we have floating exchange rates. So some people say the IMF, also the World Bank, have lost their original purpose somehow, and they're questioning whether they are still legitimate at all. What's the role of the European Union within the IMF? The EU has even more votes than the US, much more, 31%. So how come that the EU is not dominant? It's because simply they cannot agree among themselves, so they don't have consensus. So together they have more voting rights, but it doesn't happen very often that they speak with one vote, one voice, and have the same opinion within the IMF. Okay, finally, I should talk about the topic of sustainability. So, I wanted to look at it from a financial point of view. How is our financial system sustainable the way we have it at the moment? And this graph shows you the interest rate environment. Since the year 1999, Euribor is the main interest rate in Europe, the reference interest rate for which banks lend among each other within the Eurozone. And you see here, after the crisis in 2008, we had this very sharp drop down to below 1%, 0.5, 0.25. And interest rates since the year 2008 are very low, so we live in a low interest rate environment. So let's have a quick look, is it sustainable or not? If yes, why? If not, why not? To understand this, what does it mean that interest rates have dropped? It was, you could say, artificially low interest rates because central banks are pumping money into the economy. Central banks cut interest rates. It definitely would not be so low if the governments or the central banks would not interfere. Because normally what the interest rate is the price for money, the price for saving. Meaning if people save a lot, banks have a lot of deposits, they can give away cheap loans if there are a lot of savings available. That would be the real function of interest rates if they were determined by supply and demand of savings, supply and demand of money. But this is like artificially low interest rate, and there are some problems with that. So it doesn't mean that people have more savings, it just means that there was more new money pumped into the system, and this brings some problems. If you have what we call credit expansion unsupported by savings, because it gives wrong signals. The interest rate is an important signal for investors, it's an important signal for savers. Let's first look what signals the interest rate gives to businessmen. If you can get a loan very cheaply as a businessman, it indicates to you that banks have a lot of deposits, people have saved a lot, so it looks like people want to consume more in the future, and businessmen start to invest, especially in so-called interest rate sensitive sectors, typically real estate, or they expand their new business lines. All these sectors where you would take a loan, usually you don't take a loan to buy clothes or to buy food, but you take a loan to buy a house, for example, you take a loan to expand your business. And these are those interest rate sensitive sectors where you will also find over-investment and this tendency to speculative investment. Simply speaking, people don't build a house because they want to live in it, but they buy a house because they hope to resell it later at a higher price. That's the very first indicator that there is some speculative bubble building up. So this is the wrong signal that an artificially low interest rate sends to businessmen, to investors. On the other side, it also sends a signal to consumers. If the interest rate is very low, it doesn't pay off to save anymore. Why should you bring your money to the bank if they offer 0.25%? So it's a signal as a consumer to consume, not to save. So it's from two sides it's a wrong signal because for consumers saving does not pay off anymore, and businessmen think that savings have increased. The problem with this is that at some point the goods that come to the market cannot be purchased because the real savings are not available. This is the so-called business cycle theory, or the credit theory of business cycles. situation, for example, when some investors, they take a loan to build a shopping mall, and on the other hand, consumers take a loan to purchase flat screen TVs in that shopping mall. So this is a situation that can build up, and it's based on the availability of credit. But at some point, somebody will notice that they have to pay back their loan, so they have to pay back the loan for their TV, for example. And if that happens, that's usually the point when this boom ends, when people realize they have to pay back the loan, they have to pay back their mortgage, perhaps when they invested in a house. And if they cannot do that, many people will suddenly have to sell their house, banks want their money back, and this is what we call deflation. And many people at the same time have to sell their assets, prices drop sharply, a general fall, a general decrease in the price level, so deflation. So this is an example how a property bubble would end. Suddenly you see all these half-finished projects that cannot be finished because the real savings are not available. Suddenly it turns out that the demand was only based on availability of credit. So you can either have deflation as a way of ending the boom, or the other way would be inflation, meaning that you just continue this credit expansion. So you could say that you pay your credit card bill with your second credit card. But if you look at it as a metaphor, it's just like you would cure a hangover with alcohol. You can continue doing so for a while, but these bad investments will keep building up. Of course, some parties might be in favor of continued credit expansion, because credit expansion in general means that the price level goes up. If more money is pumped into the economy, prices will rise. But not all prices rise at the same level. Some prices rise sooner than others. So it depends very much where you are in the economy. Are you a person that receives the cheap money first, before prices start to rise? Or are you at the end of the chain who you already have to buy at the increased price level? So it's a matter of favoring certain groups at the expense of others. It's not so clear-cut. Is inflation good or bad? Is deflation good or bad? It always affects certain groups at the expense of others. You can even have inflation and deflation at the same time in different sectors. So you have to be careful when discussing those things. It's not so clear-cut of we are living in a deflationary environment. You can have both at the same time, different sectors. Everything is possible. Okay, finally, a couple of words. The euro crisis, because there are all discussions going on now with the upcoming elections. The euro crisis has two aspects, really. On the one hand, it's a debt crisis, the aspect we just discussed. But it's also a question whether the euro is the appropriate currency for the different countries in the European Union. Why? If we just take this very simple example, and this is most often in the news, Germany versus Greece. It's a fact that countries are different and that countries have different levels of productivity. Usually people say Germans, they live to work, and Greek people, they work to live, so to speak. So people have different attitudes, and it's just a fact that not everybody is the same. But it can cause problems if, for example, one country is very productive. Let's assume in this example that Germany can produce everything cheaper than Greece. This could lead to a situation where Germany is producing everything, is prospering. On the other hand, in Greece you would have massive unemployment because they cannot compete, they cannot produce at competitive prices. Politicians don't like that, they don't like unemployment in their country. So does it make a difference if Greece and Germany have the same currency or not? It does, because if those two countries would have different currencies, there's a so-called, well, self-correcting mechanism. It's quite simple. If you cannot produce at competitive prices, nobody will want your products. If nobody wants your stuff, nobody needs your currency. But this means that your currency will become very cheap on the international market. So in this case, the Greek drachma, I think, would become very cheap. So this triggers an opposite movement. If suddenly your currency becomes cheap, it becomes more attractive for people to purchase goods in your currency, or to make holiday in your country and pay in Greek currency. This is the so-called automatic currency counterweight. You can think about it like a buffer. If you want to compete internationally, you have two choices. You can either be very good at producing the products, have very efficient ways of producing, or you can try to keep your currency cheap. In the end, it's the same effect. If I purchase goods from China, they are very cheap, but probably not because China is so efficient, but mostly because China is keeping its currency artificially cheap. Why are they doing it? Does China want to give away free goods to the rest of the world? China wants to build capacity, like industrial capacity. They want to build industries, to get know-how into China. So there are always two sides to it. Chinese people are probably not very happy that they can export a lot, because they will not be able to purchase many goods with their cheap currency. But it's good for people who want to export to have a cheap currency. How can you tell whether your currency is overvalued or undervalued? This is one very simple way, but quite accurate. You hear about this so-called Big Mac index. No? This is just based on the idea that the price of a product like a Big Mac should be the same in all countries after you exchange the national currencies. Why? Because it's a very standardized product. There shouldn't be much differences in producing a Big Mac in many countries. But in reality, you see that there are big differences. So in some countries, Norway, Sweden, a Big Mac is 120% more expensive than, in this case, the reference is the United States. And in other countries, such as China, a Big Mac is 50% cheaper. So how is it possible that those differences persist if the Big Mac is the same everywhere? Well, simply because the demand for your currency is not only based on the demand for Big Macs, but there are many other factors. And yeah, people may want to hold dollars or Scandinavian currency for many other reasons, because they want to purchase American stocks, they want to invest in American real estate. All these factors contribute to the demand for the currency. On the opposite, those poor countries usually have undervalued currencies, simply because nobody wants their products very much, and it means nobody needs their currency, they have cheap currency, which helps them in turns to attract tourists, or at some point it makes their products more expensive when the currency falls low enough. So this is what you will learn when you take courses in economics or business. It's this way of thinking that everything has two sides, that you cannot only look at it from the side of exporter or from the side of one country. It's always good to look at things from both sides. Also to think about the long-term consequences, not only the short-term consequences of economic policies. So these are some of the reasons why you should at least take some courses in economics and business to understand economic developments, because economics tries to explain how we behave, how businesses behave, how governments behave, and it will help you to better evaluate proposals for changes in economic policies. For example, let me ask you one question. I was watching the big discussion on the TV the other day, those candidates for the EU presidency. They want to implement a minimum wage in the European Union. Do you think this is a good idea? It sounds very... People like the idea of having a minimum wage. Would you support this if some candidate proposes this idea?
You mean like one wage which is for all the countries?
Yeah, a minimum wage that...
For all the countries, like the same for all the countries?
I'm not sure if it's the same for all countries or differs between countries, but at least a minimum wage under which you...
Well, it is a good idea in theoretical thinking, but in practical, each country has some different income, which is also based on the minimum wage, so it's not really practically good.
Yeah, that's one aspect, that wage levels differ quite a lot, so it would be, first of all, almost impossible or very impractical to have the same minimum wage across the EU. But if you think about it also from the other side, people tend to think minimum wage is good. Employer receives more money, but somebody has to pay this minimum wage also. So if you're an employer, then perhaps you will not hire people anymore if you have to pay them a minimum wage. And history shows that a minimum wage hurts exactly those people that it intends to protect, those people who are willing to work at a very low wage, those people who are low skilled and they would be willing to pay the low wage, but they will not be able to get work at all anymore if there's a minimum wage under which you are not allowed to employ people at all. So this is what I mean with a different way of thinking. Economics is not science or an area that gives you a ready set of answers. It's really more a way of thinking and looking at issues. But most of all, it will give you a solid skill space to be useful in your workplace later. You cannot only apply it to economic question or finance and such. So yeah, that was it from my side. I hope I could give you a bit of an introduction of what topics we cover in the economics courses, in the business courses. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, please. Any comments, anything you would like to say or no? Please.
Well, how much can China's gold endanger US dollar?
Sorry, how much?
China's gold.
How much China's gold?
Gold, yes. Endanger US dollar.
How much China is holding?
Gold.
Yeah, I know how much gold China is holding.
Yeah, endanger US. Because I read some article a month ago.
I don't know the exact numbers, but this is one aspect we cover when we talk about the IMF, because those member countries, they are holding gold. So gold is accepted as a payment for the IMF's member countries. China is among the top 5 countries in the world of gold holdings. After the US, Germany, Italy, yeah, France. Yes.
Do you see any solution with the problem of drinking water?
If we will see any solution with the problem of drinking water, well, since it's affected by external factors such as climate change, this is nothing we can affect really. but there is a lot of, in the European Union, for example, there's a lot of regulation going on when it comes to water supply. There are countries such as Austria, for example, who have a lot of water, and they always try to use that as an argument in negotiations that they don't want to give access to the water industry to foreign companies. After the crisis in 2008, you know, there were those bailouts for Greece, and there was a lot of criticism because there are big companies in the EU, especially French companies, such as Veolia. You may know them. They're providing water in the Czech Republic, and they were demanding access to those local water industries. In exchange for the bailout, those countries have to give access to their municipal water supplies to French companies, for example. So here there's quite a war going on behind the scenes about drinking water. Any other comments, questions? I was told you should fill out a questionnaire that's on your desk. That was the one thing, if you haven't done so already. Otherwise, please feel free to pick up this map I brought you, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day and the next sessions.